So let's take a few minutes now and think a little bit more about this idea that workmen and not slaves built the pyramids. So this myth really does show up a lot in popular media. So the intro sequence to the recent uh, animated film about Egypt called Prince of Egypt, which was actually about Moses, actually shows Jewish slaves building monuments and things like that. And there's really no archaeological evidence of slaves in Old Kingdom, Middle Kingdom, or New Kingdom Egypt. So New Kingdom Egypt would have been the time of Jewish slaves if the Bible were accurate. And we've actually looked for these things throughout Egypt to see if there really were slaves, and there's really no evidence. So what we do have evidence for is workmen. And we know that these workmen were actually really well paid, and not paid as in money because there's no money yet. We're still a little too early for that. But they were paid in housing and food and a job for part of the year. So now we're going to take a few minutes and watch a video of an interview with Mark Lehner, who was the excavator who actually discovered the Giza Workmen's Village.
For 200 years, Egyptologists had studied the most important people of the time of the pyramids. The kings and their officials, they find their statues, their inscriptions, and their large tombs up on the plateau. But nobody had really answered the question, or even asked it, where were all the workers who built the pyramids? So in 1988-89, we did the first excavation here in an area about 400 meters south of the Sphinx to see if, in fact, this is where the workers lived. This is where some of the infrastructure was for building the pyramids. The site is only excavated very recently because people weren't interested in settlement. People were interested in tombs, statues, gold bowls, and mummies. Inscriptions. Egyptology really started largely as philology. But we do a different kind of archaeology. We actually save and analyze every scrap of ancient animal bone. When they butchered and consumed goats, sheep, cattle, fish, birds, they left the bones about in their garbage. And so we're doing something more like anthropology. We collect this evidence and we want to understand their diet, how they lived, what the climate was like, how they produced the food, how they gathered all this energy in one place to build the pyramids. We know that these people were fed an enormous quantity of meat. In fact, we think that using the samples of ancient bone material from their garbage, the people who lived here 4,500 years ago, we think that there's enough meat that was consumed here to feed 6,000 to 7,000 people if they ate meat every day. And a lot of this meat was cattle. And when we can age and sex the cattle, it tends to be under 18 months, under 2 years old, and mostly male. The people here were eating extraordinarily well. Prime beef. And of course, beef is the most expensive, and most prestigious of all the meat consumed. The evidence we have of their diet indicates they ate very well. So it tends to argue against the idea that these were slaves building the pyramids. In fact, the whole idea of slavery, even the question of it from a modern audience, is completely confused and misunderstood. So our work is a little bit more like a detective, like a police detective's work in a crime scene. If a police detective goes into a crime scene, ideally, she or he will not move any evidence. They photograph it. They do drawings of it. They collect fingerprints and samples of blood if there's blood in this crime scene. That's what we do, except it's not a crime scene. It's a scene where thousands of people lived. But we collect every piece of evidence. We do drawings, we do photographs, and we try to reconstruct their life. Because it's far more interesting for us than, say, another tomb with another series of texts. In fact, we almost are unhappy if we find nice things. This excavation is not about finding nice things. It's about finding information about how people lived and how they were organized.
So, based on Lehner's quick discussion there, we can see that workmen really were taken pretty decent care of. They ate a lot of meat, and meat's very expensive, even today. So, the fact that they were given a lot of decent meat was really important. And we also know that they had grain and fish and other types of fruits and things like this based on seeds. And so, these workmen, we're pretty sure, were working kind of in their off season. So if they were farmers, they might come and help build the pyramid while they were not farming, so after the harvest and before they needed to replant. If they were crafters, perhaps they took a couple months off and helped out at the work camp, building for their king when, the supply need was a little bit lower. So we're pretty sure that these pyramid builders were also taken care of in a family way. So the men were put up in these kind of like dorms. So part of his excavation finds that they lived in sort of communal housing, kind of dorm-like, or more like a military barrack, where there's a whole bunch of beds in one big room. But that their families were also sort of probably paid for their time. So the workmen were housed and fed, but they were probably given sustenance to give to the family. So they were given allotments of grain or things like that to give to, the wife and kids at home. We do assume that the pyramid builders were mostly men because in most of prehistory, societies were really kind of patriarchal. So this may be inaccurate, but it's kind of the strongest belief right now. So this also implies that people voluntarily went to build pyramids. So they saw value in it. So perhaps because of their religious ideologies, they saw that if you help build the king's tomb, then you'll probably have a pretty decent afterlife because you're actually helping out someone who's, loved by the gods, who makes the river flood every year so you can have a good harvest, and it really is very close to godliness in his life. And then after death, he actually becomes Osiris, who is the Lord of the Dead. And so if you help out in building his tomb, then you'll also be favored when you die because you did service while you were alive. So these are sort of the big ideas about Old Kingdom Egypt. We could spend another, 45 minutes talking about Middle Kingdom and then the New Kingdom. But honestly, we don't have that much time. So we do know that there was a collapse at the end of the Old Kingdom, a sort of drought, constant droughts actually. It was several years of droughts, and eventually the king stopped being able to control the whole of the Nile region, and his governors who worked, who were the nomarchs, the people that were controlling the other cities and towns, actually started to take over because they had more control over water and things like that when the Nile River wasn't flooding. So we do have a collapse period, but then, Egypt resurges again in the Middle Kingdom. And you can take another class on campus if you have more interest in that.